previously advertised to you through the newsletter and maybe through word of mouth that we're going to be spending about 3 or 4 Sundays on 3 important topics or questions of human existence. We're going to start today with the idea of mortality. Then we are going to move next Sunday to the idea of morality. And then finally, in the 3rd Sunday, or maybe carrying over into the 4th Sunday, we're going to think about meaning in life or purpose in life. And so the first one is about mortality, and I have a rather long scripture lesson that is in your bulletin, and I'm going to read part of that. Okay, I'm going to read the first part of that, and then I'm going to refer to that and maybe to the latter part as well. But there's no need to read the whole thing, but I want you to have the whole thing to take home with you. Now this is Paul's attestation, the Apostle Paul. This is his attestation of the resurrection of Jesus. You know, you folks who have been used to being in church, and most of you have made a commitment to God and to Jesus in some fashion, this sounds familiar to you. But there's a whole world out there now that it wouldn't sound familiar to them at all. You know, I was at Windy Cove for 38 years, and we had some wonderful programs, and one of the programs we had was for kids at Millbar Elementary School. They came 5 Thursdays in the fall and 5 Thursdays in the spring, and they got recreation and worship and Bible study, and they got a good meal and lots of fellowship and guidance. But I was surprised. I was surprised at the first time with those kids that we started talking about Christmas, and one of the little boys in the class had absolutely no conception that Christmas was connected with Jesus. I mean, he thought it was, a time of giving gifts and so on and so forth. But when I said something about, well, what about Jesus' birth, that he was clueless. And that, that's a shock to a pastor. That's a shock. Now, the other side of that is it was a good opportunity, right? Because we had a chance to fill in the blanks. Fill in the part about Jesus. So, I don't think these sermons are overkill for you, but I think that they are intended for you as messengers to those outside of the important questions of life, the questions of mortality, morality, and meaning. So here's Paul's attestation in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says, "Let me now remind you, dear brothers and sisters, of the good news I preached to you before. You welcomed it then, and you still stand firm in it. It is this good news that saves you, if you continue to believe the message I told you. Unless, of course, you believe something that was never true in the first place. I passed on to you what was most important and what had also been passed on to me. Christ died for our sins, just as the Scripture said. He was buried, and he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day, as the Scripture said. He was seen by Peter, and then by the 12. After that, He was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he was seen by James, and later by all the apostles, and last of all, as though I had been born at the wrong time, I also saw him. For I am the least of the apostles. In fact, I'm not even worthy to be called an apostle after the way I persecuted God's church. You all probably know the story of Paul rather well. I know most of you have been in church for a while. And the story, of course, is that he was a persecutor of the church. He thought that this stuff about Jesus was a bunch of hooey, and he set out to prove it. And he set out to prove it in a rather upfront way by persecuting people who believed in it. And he continued on that path until, on the way to Damascus, the resurrected Jesus, Jesus himself, with a resurrection body, met him and asked him why he was persecuting Jesus, me. Why are you persecuting me? Well, Paul didn't recognize him at first, but when he explained who he was, that changed Paul's whole life. That appearance of the resurrected Jesus. So I'm going to come back around to a little bit of that, but let's come back sort of to the present now. I attended 2 funerals this week. On Tuesday, I was in Lowmore, Virginia, at Mount Carmel Cemetery there. It's a little church in Lowmore, but if you don't know where you're going, you can't get to it anyhow. But it's got to go up this road and around the bend and so on and so forth. I finally got there, and it's good I got there because I was preaching that funeral. You know, the pastor's worst nightmare is being late for a funeral. I was 15 minutes ahead of time because I thought, I'm not sure where this place is. So I preached that funeral, and that lady, her name was E. She went by her initial as her name, as her first name. Her name was E. Heilman. Okay? And her husband was one of my best friends, and we developed a friendship through Dabney Lancaster Community College, where I've been teaching as an adjunct for 35 years. And Chuck Heilman was part of the administration there and dealt mostly with scholarships and things like that. But after he retired, E asked him, well, Chuck, you know, now that you're retired, you know, you can do whatever you want. What is something you really want to do? I want to help you do it. And wonder, wonder, miracle of miracles, Chuck said to his wife, E, he said, I'd like to take some of Mr. Sherrard's Bible classes. Well, if the truth be known, he was capable of teaching my Bible classes, not just taking them. But we developed a wonderful friendship because we drove to class for a number of years. And we got plenty of time to talk to each other about many, many different topics. Mrs. Heilman was primarily a homemaker. She raised 2 boys and 2 girls, but then when they got old enough to be on their own, she became a teacher's aide at Millborough Elementary School, and she helped with the disadvantaged kids. So she put her life to a useful purpose. And she, after she had, sometime before she had passed away, she told her children that she wanted Mr. Sherrard to do her funeral. So that's why I was involved with her funeral. I had participated in Chuck's funeral about 10 years ago, but Mrs. Hyman said we want to have Mr. Sherrard back, and that's why I was at the funeral and had primary responsibility for it on Tuesday. Now yesterday I was back out in Bath County, and I was there for the funeral of Leo Shanks. Now, I'm not sure, but there might be one or two in here that would recognize that name. Leo and his brother Wilson Shanks were loggers, and had been loggers in Bath County and this surrounding area for many, many long years. Leo was an elder at Windy Cove, a trustee at Windy Cove. He'd been at Windy Cove about 70 years of his 87 years that he lived. He was just a good and responsible Christian man. And 38 of those years that he was there, I was his pastor. So I knew what kind of a man he was, and I knew how he took care of his family. His wife's name was Imogene. She's still living. He had several children. Those children had children. Those children had other children. So he had, his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and even, I think, one or two great-great-grandchildren along the way. And I did not have the responsibility for that funeral because I left Windy Cove. I retired from Windy Cove in 2018, and they have a new pastor, which, by the grace of God, they haven't had a new pastor for about 2 years now. And I don't want to go off on a rabbit trail here, but the pastor that they have now, his name is Con Sauls. But the reason they have him is because Con was the pastor of a church in Tennessee, and in 2018 and 19, he was taking a sabbatical, and he was going to Canada. Only the nearer he got to Canada, Canada said, "You can't come here because of COVID." And so instead of going to Canada, he looked up campsites, and he was sort of familiar with this area. He looked up campsites, and he ended up camping on the Cowpasture River at the campground run by one of the elders of Windy Cove. And eventually that led to his becoming the pastor at Windy Cove. Otherwise, there is absolutely no way he would have become the pastor at Windy Cove. But I did get an opportunity at the funeral, even though I wasn't the lead pastor, I did get an opportunity after the children and others had spoken about Leo. I did get an opportunity to say a few words as his longtime pastor, and I was privileged to do that. Now that's sort of a long introduction, but it comes to a head. Right? It comes to a head right now with this question. Where are those two people now? That's the question of mortality. What happens when you die? Now, I'm going to come back and answer that question, okay? But I'm going to have a little insert, okay? I'm going to go back. I got that time machine going today, right? I'm going to go back to 1979 when I was in Union Seminary in Richmond. And I was taking a directed study, and what that meant was it wasn't really a regular class. it was a class that I had worked out with one of my professors at Union so that he would mentor me, and we would get together once a week and talk about, and the subject of the class was doing Bible studies. So he would meet with me once a week, and we would talk over, well, I was doing a Bible study at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Richmond, and he would talk to me about that. Well, how's it going? What did you use? What was the subject matter? How did it go? Did people respond? You know, all those pertinent issues. One of those days that we were talking, the conversation kind of worked its way around, okay, to the question of mortality, of life after death. Okay? And his name was Dr. Sibley Towner, and he said to me, and this is a quote, I got it written down here, but you know, Rob, all the major questions in life resolve themselves into the question of what happens to a person when that person dies. Now, he got me thinking. You know, I was still a fairly young man, but I've been around a little bit. I graduated from college. I've been to UVA Law School. I've been in the Navy 3 years as a judge advocate, and I was in seminary for 2. So I thought about some of these questions, but that really got me thinking about what I thought and about what other people thought about what does happen to people when they die. And he was saying to me, and I think he was mostly right. What he was saying is that oftentimes the way people live their lives depends on what they think about is going to happen to them when they die. You know, you have to get to a certain age before you start to think about dying. You know, I mean, when I was a teenager, well, I'm going to have to retract this. I was going to say when I was a teenager, I never thought about dying. That's not quite true, because as I was telling some of the parishioners out on the front porch this morning, my parents owned a cemetery, so we did think about dying. You know, by the time I was in high school, we were having more than 300 burials a year. We had 46 acres of cemetery, which was a lot of cemetery. So I did think about it, but maybe not that seriously. Maybe not that seriously. I think one thing that, and you all might have different responses to how aging kind of eventually sort of confronted you. I think, and this didn't knock me down, but it caused me to take a step back. But my wife and I, when our kids all of a sudden turned out to be in their 40s, it's like, whatever happened to the, you know, those cute little kids we had, you know, the romper room rats or something. You know, and we started thinking, 40s? If they're 40, we must be, oh no, let's not go there. Okay? So we started thinking about some of these important questions in life. Questions of mortality. And I would add to Dr. Towner's list the other 2 issues that we're going to take up. Not only the question of mortality, that is what happens to you when you die, but how should you live your life? That's the question of morality. Should I do this or should I do that? Okay? And then the final question, and this is an extremely important question in our culture, especially in our culture. What's the purpose of life? What gives, what gives meaning to people's lives. You know, I'm going to go into a story about that later on, a couple of Sundays from now. But there was a young lady years ago who was a member of a cult in San Diego named Heaven's Gate. Some of you might remember it. It made the television because the members of that cult took a suicide pact. And they decided to kill themselves one by one by one by one. The unusual thing was that they filmed some people talking about their lives before they committed suicide. And one of those, which really struck me at the time, one of those folks said, "I'm 42 years old, and I've never found anything worth living for." Now, to me, I'm not judging the woman for what she thought, but to me that seems utterly ridiculous. I mean, you know, I could name about 10 things short of religious things, you know, or things of faith, but things like family and helping others and education, and, you know, I can name that I think are worth living for. But she hadn't seen it. And she committed suicide. So we're going to get to that in a couple of weeks. But now I am jumping back to what happened to those people that I was involved with those funerals this week. Now y'all are smart enough to know that I think that the Christian answer is the most solid answer to that question. But there are other answers. I'm trying to be honest here. Okay? So, one of the answers to that question of mortality, what happens to a person when he or she dies, one of the answers is what, you know, people have called the materialistic answer. Okay? And the materialistic answer is just that. Your body is made up of a bunch of materials that, you know, are seen in nature, and when you die, your body decays and everything goes back to nature, and that's it. Okay, so I was a little bit interested in developing that a little more, so just for your own I don't know, I was going to say pleasure and excitement, but that's probably not a good choice. But just for your own information, what are the main chemicals in the body? Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, and then it goes down to trace elements from there on. But that's what some people believe, right? And it's not just a recent belief. You know, if you know anything about the philosopher Socrates, when he was on trial in Athens and was convicted, and his punishment was to drink the hemlock poison, that's his punishment. You know, he said, well, there's really only two choices. He said, either I'll drink the hemlock and I'll die, and my body will go back to the earth, which that's the materialistic view, right? Or he said, I'll end up, you know, in a better place with the gods. Of course, he didn't have a very clear understanding who the gods were. But he knew that it was either materialism or maybe. He wasn't really concerned about which one was okay, but he said, it's either materialism or something else. I'll find out when I die. Okay. So materialism has been around for a long time. Yeah, and I don't think people don't think about the way the way they used to. You know, one complication to materialism today is that before, when they just put you in a pine box and you weren't even embalmed, you deteriorated pretty quick. And that kind of materialism didn't look that great. You know, now, well, they put you in a casket, put the casket in a vault, they bury the vault. That vault has got a long lifespan. It's not indestructible, but it's got a long lifespan. And maybe people are tempted not to worry. Well, I just lay there, whatever. I don't know. One unusual variation of that was the baseball player Ted Williams. Do we have baseball fans in here, or do I have to shelve all my baseball references? Ted Williams used to play for the, I'm going to fix my hearing aid a little bit. There you go. Ted Williams used to play for the Boston Red Sox. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful hitter. Last person to bat over 400 in the major leagues back in 1941. When he died some years ago, about 25 years ago now, when he died, he was kind of hedging his bets about materialism and what he had his family do, or whoever he was paying to get it done. What he had them do is they froze the dead body. He was holding out hope just in case there might be something else and I might need my body. So that was called, I think it's called cryogenesis. Get really cold and you'll be okay. Terrible. Okay. That's materialism. I can't take as much time on the next one, which is Eastern religions. Most of them have a view that at death, your body and your spirit separate. And your body goes to the ground, but your spirit continues on. Now, that sounds a lot like Christian belief and practice, the way you phrase it. But that's not. You know, when you do the Apostles' Creed, do you say, I believe in the resurrection of the Spirit? I don't think so. I believe in the resurrection of the body. Okay? But in Hinduism and Buddhism, okay, they believe that the body goes to the ground, the spirit somehow lives on. Now, here's the bad news from Buddhism and Hinduism. If you haven't already worked off your bad karma, you got to come back. That's where reincarnation comes in. Christians do not believe in reincarnation. That's an Eastern belief. Hinduism and Buddhists believe in reincarnation. That's when they come back trying to live a more perfect life. Okay? But if they don't do that, even with their own teaching, if they don't do that, then they still have to be reincarnated again and again and again. And there's a famous story, and there's no guarantee that you're going to be reincarnated as a human being. You might come back the next time as an animal. Well, you really messed up this time, so you're coming back as an animal. There's a famous story about the philosopher Pythagoras, you know, the guy with the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, you know, et cetera, et cetera. he was walking along one day and this dog started barking. Woo, woo, woo. And he claimed to one of his colleagues that he was walking with. He said, "I know that guy." Wow. Okay. Now, how about the answer to my original question? Where are these people? Okay. Our Christian view of mortality is much, much different. We believe that those who accept Jesus in this life, when they die, they go to heaven to live with the Jesus, and they gain a new resurrected body. They're still going to be their kind of same, similar selves, only better. You know, one of my favorite funeral verses is from John 14. You know, Jesus' disciples at the upper room, they were worried about Jesus going away. He kept telling them, "I'm going away. Where I go, you cannot follow," etc., etc. So they were worried, rightfully so, right? They've been following him for 3 years. But he said, "No, it's expedient for you that I go. It's good for you that I go away." And then they said, "Well, what's going on with that? What's up with that?" And he said, "When the time is right, I will come again and take you to be with me. In my Father's house there are many mansions. I have built you a home in my Father's house to continue your life in the Christian family." You know, friends, I can stand before you without a doubt today and say that E. Heilman and Leo Shanks are both now with Jesus, because in that passage in John 14, Jesus says, "I will come again." He doesn't delegate that to somebody else. You know, a lot of times Jesus does delegate things, right? A good pianist, you know, he has to play the music. Good singers are in the choir, even a good evangelist and things like that. But that's one part of the Christian faith that Jesus does not delegate. He said, "I